Welcome to another anniversary. I've started calling these segments Cineversaries, combining cinema with anniversary. Today is a very, very, very special one. Um, this film came out in 1989. So this will be the 35th anniversary of this particular movie on this day. And I am unbelievably pumped to talk about it. In fact, I'm so pumped to talk about it that this is my second recording of this video, truthfully. The first recording, I made it the entire way through, and it turns out that it recorded absolutely no audio, and it was quite lengthy. So we're going to try this again. But it is that big of a movie to me that honestly, it does not matter. This film deserves all of the credit that it gets. It deserves to be celebrated, especially on a milestone like 35 years. Came out the year I was born. In fact, it came out before I was born. And it just, it will forever hold a special place in my heart because of the character in which it portrays, as well as the acting in said movie and writing and literally just everything about it. Prior to this particular movie coming out, the story in which it was telling really wasn't given the credit it deserves. At least a lot of people have said that. It was very the prior renditions of it, including the people that made this movie, have stated were very campy, and it to me it established and kicked off the proper way in which you do a superhero movie. And with that, you probably have figured out what we're going to be discussing. Today is the 35th anniversary of Tim Burton's 1989 classic, Batman. So let's start talking about it. It's important to remember that prior to this movie coming out, Batman was really only known for really that TV series persona, other than the comics, obviously. And the TV series was a lot more campy. You couldn't hear Batman without hearing pow, wham. So no one had really done or given proper credit to Bruce Wayne and Batman's story, which was originally told in a much more dark, serious manner by, and I want to be clear on this, by Bob Kane and Bill Finger. I want to be very clear about Bill Finger having a role in that. And I think for years Bob Kane kind of got all of the credit, and he does not get all of the credit. And there's a much deeper story there. I would encourage you, if you like Batman, and he is, like me, your favorite superhero, and you want to know as much as you can about him, go and watch that documentary on Bill Finger, because it is incredibly important. That being said, we're talking today about 1989's Batman. So let's go into that. Let's talk about kind of what leads up to it, the actual making of it, and then we'll go into a little bit of what happens as it comes out. So, really, let's start back in 1979, so 10 years prior, with Michael Uslan, who would go on to become the executive producer. But at the time, he had become a teacher or a professor at a college where he was going to be teaching about comic books. And it was going to be like an accredited course. It's going to be a big deal. And the head of the school calls him in and basically tells him, so you're the one that's going to be teaching about comic books. And he says, I understand your love of comic books. I understand your love of the stories. I grew up with Superman and loved it. But ultimately, these are not mythologies. They're not history. They don't have. They're kind of just not trash, but just above it. And I think this is a conversation that's happening within the film industry currently. I know that Martin Scorsese has referred to comic book movies ever so lovingly as amusement parks. That they're not cinema, and I think that's actually, for me personally, I think that's actually part of the problem in film today, and why it's so hard to get people to identify and get passionate about film, is because you make statements like that, and you're basically making yourself the definitive judge of what is cinema and what's not. So I would absolutely disagree. That's more of the same discussion as Michael Uslan was having with the head of the university he was at. And so Michael hears him out, and he says, fair enough. Just answer me this. Are you familiar with the story of Moses? And the head of the university says, absolutely. And Michael says, well, can you recount that story to me? And the head of the university says, of course. There were two Hebrew parents that the firstborn were being killed, and they wanted to save their child. And so they put the child in a basket, and then two Egyptian parents come along and take him in, and he goes on to be a hero for the Hebrew people. And Uslan then said, okay, now you mentioned liking Superman. Can you recount the story of Superman to me? And the head of the university said, yeah, of course. He said, he had two parents on Krypton, and Krypton was going to be destroyed, and they wanted to save their baby. And so they sent their baby to the planet Earth, and two parents from Earth discovered the baby and took him in, and then he stopped, and he said, your class is accredited. And that's the story, which is just brilliantly done by Michael Uslan, and really shows where a lot of the stories that we know and we love get inspiration, and it really helps debunk the whole conversation around comics are just garbage, and that they're not meaningful, because they absolutely are, and the characters in them are. And I've got some notes here that I'm going to go through. So if you see me look down, that's why. So let's continue talking about Michael. He then starts teaching the course, becomes well known, gets invited out to New York, where some folks want to dive deeper into comics. And as I recall, just film in general with comic books. And you got to remember that prior to this, there was another extremely successful comic book film from DC, starring Christopher Reeves and Gene Hackman in Superman. That had already come out. So this group that Uslan went to talk to in New York were very interested in him, and he has said that his goal was to produce a film that would give Batman the credit he deserves and tell the actual story based around the source material and the way it's meant to be told. And so that's what he set out to do. It ended up becoming, as he put it, a 10-year odyssey. He could not get anybody to take on, studio-wise, the movie Batman. He actually ends up forming a relationship with United Artists, which, interesting story there. I believe I read this in my book on this particular actor. One of my all-time favorite actors is Claude Rains, who's known for Invisible Man, Notorious by Alfred Hitchcock. Many people know him for his role in Casablanca. But I believe he had a role in forming United Artists. I could be wrong there, but I think he did. And the reason I tell you that is because Michael Uslan goes to United Artists. They are on board with making all of this a reality. And they know that Michael cannot get a studio to sign on. So they go to someone that they were close with named Peter Guber. And Peter had a company called Casablanca, which is just the way these things work out is absolutely fascinating. Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction, especially when dealing with the making of a movie. But they go to Peter and talk to him about the idea, and Peter says, "Get Michael out here as soon as you possibly can." And so Michael goes out and he sees Peter, and Peter gets it. As Michael is pitching what he wants to do with Batman, Peter absolutely gets it and says, "You want to do a dark, serious version of Batman that's true to the source material. I absolutely get it. Here's what I want you to do. When you leave this office, I want you to go and see essentially kind of the head of our business department, and I don't want you to leave until a deal has been made." And sure enough, 3 days later, a deal was made. Now, Peter was really close or had a relationship with Universal Studios. DC Comics was pretty much a property of Warner Brothers Studios, but I believe something had happened where they didn't necessarily have full rights to Batman, and so Peter could get away with going to Universal Studios, which is who he pitches the script to first. And Universal Studios does a hard pass on it, which I'm sure they regret today, but they have given us so many great films, and every studio has a story like that. But they have a hard pass on it, and ultimately, where Peter ends up going is to Warner Brothers, which at the time was run by Frank Wells. And if you think you know that name, you probably do. Frank Wells would go on in the 90s to become the co-head of Disney with Michael Eisner. Tremendously important person. He actually would later pass away in a helicopter crash, and which is a tremendous loss. But that's a whole other story. Anyway, Peter goes to Frank Wells at Warner Brothers, and Warner Brothers at the time is coming, like I said, they're coming off that high of Superman, and so they're very interested in continuing going down the line essentially of these DC heroes. And the way it's told is that Frank Wells was incredibly eager to bring Batman back under the wing, pun absolutely intended, of Warner Brothers. So that blended with again the high that they were on from Superman led to essentially Warner Brothers making the deal and doing Batman. So let's dive into the making of the movie. I mean, one of the important things to note about this particular film is that for its time, it was one of the most expensive films ever made. And Jack Nicholson, interestingly enough, who is always an absolutely interesting character in any story, he has stated that he not only knew how big of a success it was going to be, but also put some of his own money into the project. It shows how much he really believed in it. The movie was filmed in England. I believe that they had made that decision to save some money, but also, as Tim Burton puts it, it allowed him to focus on the film and not as much on all of the business side associated with the movie back in the States. So, Tim Burton gets pulled in, obviously, as the director of this. It's important to note that shortly before this movie came out, he had finished Beetlejuice, which was in 1988, just a year prior to the release of this movie. He had pretty much signed on before Beetlejuice had come out, but the way that he puts it, he feels like the studio was actually waiting to see how Beetlejuice did before giving that final sign-off on him being director. Ultimately, Beetlejuice did well, and he would become the director. And they were going to need a screenwriter, which would be inevitably Sam Hamm, who Tim Burton knew, and asked him, would you be interested in helping write Batman? To which Sam Hamm jumped at it. Absolutely. So, shooting the film started during the winter of 1988 in England, and each day started at around 4 p.m., which in England at that point in the year, that time, it would be dark already, and they would shoot the film from 4 p.m. through 5 to 6 a.m., which means nobody ever really saw daylight, which is perfect for a film that needed to be as dark as the source material required. So they would shoot for 6 days out of the 7 of the week. Tim Burton has stated that he will never do that again. To quote him, quote, "I felt like a fighter that didn't have time to step back and breathe." There were actually for 3 months, for 3 straight months, he did not see any daylight, which can take a toll. But that is the way in which he filmed it. And, I think a big piece of this and a big piece of the history to note is there was really kind of a ragtag crew. And you know what? We'll get to that in just a minute. Because I do want to make a note of something that Nicholson said about Tim Burton. He was quoted as saying, "What fascinates me about Tim is the unshakable self-confidence and lack of fear that he has," which is incredibly important to have from a director for the cast and the crew. It's widely known in Hollywood. In fact, Spielberg talks about the advice he got when he first became a director, in the fact that never let them see you sweat, essentially. Because if it looks like you don't know what you're doing, then you have lost the confidence of everyone. So, Tim was under a lot of pressure. Tim Burton was under a ton of pressure. And that was because he hadn't really done a big blockbuster at that point. Like I said, he had Beetlejuice, but hadn't really done a big time budget blockbuster film. And on top of that, because of that reason, they didn't go, of course, Mr. Burton, you can do whatever you want. He didn't have the street cred. So he really couldn't make that happen. On top of all of that, like I said, I mean, you got to remember, this movie had one of the biggest budgets in film history. So he's got that on top of everything else. Now, back to that ragtag crew that I was starting to mention. Roger Pratt was the director of photography, and he talks about how he feels like everybody was skeptical of him, including Tim Burton, at least at times. But that his ultimate goal during the filming process was to make sure that Tim Burton had the shots the way in which he wanted them. And I think Roger Pratt did an incredible job for this movie. Tim Burton himself was 31 years old. He was still young. He had done Beetlejuice, but really prior to that, I mean, he had Frankenweenie, which actually got him some attention for this movie. Believe it or not. So, there's that piece. And as you'll, learn a little bit later, even Danny Elfman, people were skeptical about him on the music side of things. The film itself was filmed in a very old-fashioned way, full set, but also models that were utilized instead of necessarily, computer graphics and that kind of thing. Nicholson has stated that one of the reasons he feels that this movie was as successful as it was is due to the amount of collaboration on it. And a perfect example of this is halfway through the filming of this movie, John Peters, who was one of the producers, and Jack Nicholson go to the opera. They go to see Phantom of the Opera. And at the end of Phantom of the Opera, there's a big climax scene that takes place in a tower. And as they're watching that, Jack and John both get the idea, we absolutely have to have something like this in the movie. The movie needs this. And the very next day, they began writing the ending scene around the Joker in the tower, at least one of the ending scenes, him in the tower, and then obviously the dancing and all that. And it's just a fantastic scene, absolutely fantastic scene, but inspired by Phantom of the Opera, which is just a fascinating little tidbit about this movie that I didn't know. On top of all of that, Nicholson has also stated that a lot of improvisation happened before filming some scenes and during filming scenes, kind of in the moment. A perfect example of this, the screenwriter, Sam Hamm, was very clear about the fact he did not write into the script, and if you haven't seen the movie for whatever reason, and again, absolutely no judgment if you haven't seen it. If you haven't, yet again, you're in for a treat. Go watch it. Spoiler here. So go ahead and stop. Come back maybe in a couple minutes. Go a couple minutes in here. Sam Hamm did not write the piece of the story where Jack Napier, or the Joker, killed Bruce Wayne's parents and ultimately made Batman. The Joker is responsible for creating Batman, and my goodness, I mean, so Sam Hamm says he did not write that, and he was very clear about that. And on top of that, he has stated that uh, he fought Tim Burton to make sure that that part of the story did not end up in the final film. But ultimately, what happens is that there's a screenwriter strike that takes place back in the States. He has to go back to the States, which leaves Tim Burton alone with his own thoughts, and that makes it into the story. And to me, this movie is so much stronger because of it. So that's how that made it in. And honestly, I would say that this is probably, in general, something to discuss just about Batman. And this has that particular aspect has a very key piece in what I'm about to say, and that is, I don't know that there's really a better duo out there, and I don't mean duo as in Batman and Robin duo. I'm talking hero villain. I don't know that there's ever going to be a better pairing than Batman and the Joker. There just isn't. So the relationship that the two of them have and really develop in a way that you can't have the Joker without Batman, and you can't have Batman without the Joker. The two can only exist together. And that's what you see in this movie. And it's partially because of the way in which Burton told this story about how the Joker made Batman. And then later on, Jack Nicholson states to Michael Keaton, "You idiot, you made me." Remember? And that is absolutely the case. So the two are kind of responsible for creating the other. So just to me, masterfully done. This would not have been the film that it was without that piece of the story. It would not. That is a key piece. On top of that, another piece that was improvised that Sam Hamm, the screenwriter, has said is probably the number one question he gets anytime people find out he was the screenwriter for Batman, and that is, was it your idea to let Vicky Vale into the Batcave? A lot of people have a huge problem with that. And Sam said, absolutely not. That was not my idea. I did not write that. If it were up to me, Alfred would have been fired next day for letting anyone into that Batcave. Ultimately, I believe the story goes that it was a decision based around time constraints on the film and a decision that Burton made. And that's how that happened. Whether or not you appreciate it, that's the story. Now let's talk about Danny Elfman, because I mentioned him not that long ago. Danny Elfman has stated there was a lot of skepticism around him on this particular movie. And the way that he tells it, he was brought in by Tim Burton to essentially pitch his music to John Peters. And at the time, Danny Elfman stated he hadn't really he'd never done a big budget film and hadn't ever done an action film like this. And so he understood kind of that skepticism. And Elfman says that he kind of was a little bit scatterbrained all over the place, which ultimately he said, looking at John Peters, it was like you could see the bubble over his head saying, I wonder if so-and-so is available to be the composer for this. And he said that he looked at Tim Burton, and Tim Burton was saying, play the march, play the march, play the march. And Elfman would ultimately play the march that he had written for Batman, which I believe becomes the theme of Batman. To this day, I adore it. I adore it. I cannot think of Batman without hearing Elfman's music. I cannot disconnect those two. It would also go on to be a part of Batman the Animated Series, and that is I grew up watching that, and that was a fantastic animated series. Actually won Emmys, but anyway. So Elfman plays the march for John Peters, and the way that he puts it, John Peters then stood up or jumped out of his seat upon hearing it and started dancing. And so that's how Danny Elfman got that part. So the original date for the film itself was actually June 19th. And Peter Guber, the way that he tells it, you don't want to deviate from the date you're releasing a movie, because it is a very, it has serious consequences. And he's like, I'm not talking about, a day or two, but if you deviate a week or a month, it can hurt you in serious ways. And especially, you got to remember, this movie, it comes out in 1989. We're not talking about the internet in the way we know it today. We're not talking about smartphones in the way in which we know them today, or smartphones at all, for that matter. So if you change the date of something back then, you can't correct that in a viral way for enough people to know that that date has changed. But it also has other consequences. And the way that Peter Guber puts it, one would be people start to think that it's not going to be a good film. And they lose faith in that, which can hurt you with funding. Two, it costs a lot more money now. Now you've got to pay for marketing further out. And then number three, you get out of sync with the marketing, which is what I was just talking about. I mean, back then you've got movie posters that have got the date on it. People have seen nothing but June 19th, and now you're going to have to push the date. So that becomes a problem. And of course, now we know ultimately it would come out on June 23rd. Let's talk about marketing for a second, because first of all, it's been said that during filmmaking, there wasn't a lot of talk about this being a franchise by any means. In fact, I think it was Tim Burton that made that statement. And some have actually said the marketing for this movie is widely considered to be the best marketing for a movie in the history of film. Now that was, I'm fairly certain, said back in the 90s, in what I had seen, where that statement was made. But still, this is a masterclass in marketing, and the reason that it is, and the way they put it, give me one moment. The way that they put it is you couldn't walk 10 feet without seeing someone in a Batman shirt or someone in a Batman hat. Not just that, people were buying Batman ties, t-shirts, underwear, cufflinks, costumes. It was the number one costume for Halloween. And to this day, it's probably still one of the number one costumes for Halloween. And on top of that, specifically the '89 version of the costume, which gets into the logo, which we'll talk about more in depth here in just a second. Tim Burton himself is quoted as saying, "I think when I saw the Batman cereal, that's when it hit me. Whoa," end quote. That was Tim Burton. So that's when he realized, oh, this is getting big. This is a big deal. According to Jack Nicholson, all of the Joker products that were made sold out before the film even came out. The way he puts it, quote, "They had more customers than they had product for this particular movie." So the logo on top of that at the time was risky in and of itself. I said we'd come back to the logo. Peter Guber puts it that they brought the logo in. He looked at it and he said, "What am I looking at? This looks like I'm looking down the back of somebody's throat." And then the more that he looked at it, it was like it revealed itself, and he said that almost gave it even more power. And in fact, Jack Nicholson himself, in the interview in which I saw, he's actually wearing the logo as a pin, and he referred to it as, quote, "a great piece of graphic art." So big deal. Now, we talked a little bit about music with Danny Elfman, but there's there's just as big of a name that deserves absolute credit and to be discussed here. And if you did not know, and I think some people don't, Prince wrote a lot of the music for this particular film. In fact, Prince at the time was a Warner Brothers artist, and he put together so many songs that not only did 3 or 4 songs like "Trust" in the movie, which is the music that's playing as the Joker's throwing the money from the float, or "Party Man," which is the music that plays when the Joker goes into the museum and starts painting over paintings and busts and that kind of thing. That "Party Man" is what's playing during that scene. So not only did Prince have 3 or 4 instances where his songs made it into the film, he actually released a companion album to the movie on top of the score that was released for the movie, and was a part of music videos and the marketing, and just a brilliant mind in general, but very much so for Batman. And to this day, I think that "Trust" and "Party Man" are quite possibly some of my favorite music in any Batman film. And Nicholson just pairs with it. Chef's kiss beautifully. Guy's got some rhythm. So Prince absolutely had an integral role for this movie. Now, they had a 30-second trailer for the film that they wanted to test with an audience, and ultimately they had a 90-second trailer. But by the end of the trailer for the audience, they stood up and they gave it a standing ovation. So as you can see, there's a critical mass that's building here around this movie. The trailer itself was so in demand that people were actually paying to go to movies, paying for movie tickets to films that they didn't even care about, to see the trailer, and then they would get up when it ended and leave the movie. They paid a movie ticket value for a 90-second trailer, which is astonishing and absolutely a fascinating piece of Batman's history. Tim Burton has said that ultimately the trailer was meant to stop all the campy camp talk about the movie. And we'll get more into it when we start talking about cast. But there very much so was a discussion around the fact that, oh no, we're going to have another comedy or comedic take of Batman or campy take of Batman. And that is absolutely not the discussion the filmmakers wanted to have. So the trailer was meant to stop that conversation from occurring. Ultimately, people were actually paying $25 at comic book conventions just to get their hands on the trailer. And furthermore, bus stations that had the posters for Batman had those posters getting broken into and stolen because of how in demand the poster was. I mean, this is astonishing stuff for a movie. And honestly, tells you how great of a movie this really was, and how great the marketing was on this. It really speaks to that component. Now, at the time, theater owners were actually scared when they first saw the film because they didn't know how audiences were going to react. You got to remember that theater owners at the time were a more conservative and older group, and the only Batman that they would have known or resonated with was the campy, more Adam West style Batman. And turns out that the young loved it. They enjoyed the darkness of it and the almost thriller, scary components. They ate it up. The film itself premiered on a Monday at the Westwood Theater. And by Wednesday, 2 days later, people were camped outside to make sure they could get a ticket. By Friday, there was a line that stretched past the block, around the block, making this a blockbuster, as we've come to know, and as I shared from Jaws and its anniversary. So now we've kind of discussed the lead up, the movie coming out. Let's talk about the cast a little bit because that's very important. Very, very important. First being just an incredible actor that I could watch in absolutely anything. Absolutely anything. If I find out he's in something, I'm watching it. And that's Michael Keaton. And Michael Keaton, for me, and I know I'm getting ready to start a big debate, and it goes without saying, my opinion is not the definitive opinion, and guess what? There's not a definitive opinion on the best Batman or Bruce Wayne. You know why? Because this is art we're talking about. So whoever your favorite Batman and Bruce Wayne is just as valid as who I'm about to say, and that is Michael Keaton. To me, Michael Keaton is my Batman. In terms, especially in terms of live action, probably just overall, but especially in terms of live action. Now, casting him actually caused an absolute firestorm of activity. Many believed it meant that the film was going to be comedic, and you got to remember what people would have known Michael Keaton for at that time. I mean, we're talking Mr. Mom, Beetlejuice was darker, but it had comedic components to it, especially Michael Keaton's character. Um, in fact, it caused such a firestorm that the Wall Street Journal, of all places, um, actually had an article that was asking what was wrong with the crew for picking Michael Keaton to be Batman. They just felt this doesn't work. It's not gonna work, um, and they legitimately thought that um, the film was going to be a disaster. In fact, it wasn't just the Wall Street Journal. I mean, many people began thinking the film was going to be a disaster, all because they picked Michael Keaton to be Batman. And obviously, the article coming out like that causes even more people to feel that way, and it can be a blessing and a curse. It gets attention for the movie, but it also draws unwanted negativity towards it. So Tim Burton said that he actually cast him partially because of his eyes. And that's incredible forethought on Tim Burton's part, because he knew for a lot of the film, if not most of the film, that Michael Keaton was going to have to be in a cowl, which means his eyes were going to have to tell the story in a lot of ways. And Burton, quote, said he's got crazy eyes, but he also doesn't, and this is important, this is very important, that really shows the wisdom of Tim Burton, even at 31, at a young age. He said he also doesn't look like a superhero. He looks like a guy that would need to dress up like a bat in order to have complete effect. That makes total sense, because it's not necessarily believable that as part of the story that the costume just kind of shows up. Nobody questions why this guy is in a bat costume. Michael Keaton, and we'll discover more on this here in just a second, thanks to Billy D. Williams, who played Harvey Dent. But Michael Keaton isn't, or at the time was not this deep, serious actor. He was not a, Popeye Doyle figure, like a Gene Hackman would have been. That makes the story of Bruce Wayne that much more believable. That much more believable. It's important to note, too, that Keaton completely trusted Tim Burton at this point, especially because of Beetlejuice, which came out the year prior. And he said that if he'd gotten the script from any other person, he wouldn't have even read it. But because it came from Tim Burton, he knew he needed to read it. He knew he had to read it. So Tim Burton said he didn't want to put a serious actor into a Batman costume because that would, in essence, just make it laughable. With Michael Keaton, he could portray, the way he puts it, a driven Bruce Wayne that was absolutely consumed by the death of his parents, by what he'd gone through, and became a believable vigilante, essentially, in the form of Batman. And he would have absolutely needed to have this persona that would have required a costume to get across the full effect that Batman needed. Billy D. Williams, who played Harvey Dent, said, we were coming back to that. He describes watching Michael Keaton, and he says that he noticed that he had three distinct qualities, and I think he's nailed them. Number one, he was common. He was common. He was relatable, essentially. Number two, he possessed a vulnerability, which was also very critically important for a superhero, a vulnerability. And number 3, he was mysterious. And that is absolutely the case as well. He had a mysteriousness about him. This air of I don't know everything there is to know about this guy, and he crushed it. He absolutely crushed it, and that brings us to again, my personal opinion, my all-time favorite Joker. Again, at least in live action, Mark Hamill is probably my favorite voice of the Joker. And if we're talking animated, he just nobody does the Joker like Mark Hamill. But if we're talking live action, Jack Nicholson is at the pinnacle of the Joker for me. So numerous names actually came up in conversation when discussing the Joker, including Robin Williams. But that being said, Nicholson was everyone's first choice. The thing to note about Jack Nicholson, and what I found out from doing research, is that he doesn't just work with a director. He doesn't just out of the blue do it. But once he does work with a director, you have his complete support and trust. But you've got to earn it, and you've got to convince him. So the story goes, because you knew there was going to be a story, especially with Nicholson. That's why we love him. Peter Guber and Tim Burton fly out to meet him in Aspen, Colorado. And when they get there, Jack Nicholson is on a horse and basically just is saying, let's go ride. To which Tim Burton says, I don't ride. And Peter proceeds to say, you do today. Which I can just see this playing out in slow motion. The minute that Tim Burton says, I don't ride, Peter just slowly turning and looking at him like, you're going to cost us this. You do today is Peter's response. And ultimately what would come out of that, and I'll try to, Peter tells it that there's a great picture out there somewhere of Tim Burton on horseback with Jack Nicholson, and Peter says that he basically looks as though he had discovered God. And I think by that he just means, and Burton talks about this, how mortified he was to even be on a horse. So if I can find that picture, I'll put it up here. But so ultimately, what comes out of this is that Jack Nicholson agrees to do the movie. They form a unique bond, him and Tim Burton, and a very close one. So Jack's concern about the movie was due to the television series, and that concern was that it was going to end up like it, in the sense of, as he puts it, let's brighten it up for the kids, that it would use that same mentality. To Nicholson, and wise beyond his time on this, he felt that this moment was a pinnacle moment, a big transitional moment for both the character of Batman and just the story. And that it would send a message that this was not just another cartoon movie. So Peter Guber said they changed the nature of the story from a comic to a film by hiring Jack. That's important. And that goes back to what we were talking about with the fact that prior to this movie, DC had Superman. And it had essentially what was kind of known as the Brando concept. And that was, by getting a big name like a Brando, you could give a respectability to a picture. And that's what they were doing with Jack. And the minute that they got him, that's why Peter Guber says that is the minute it went from another, a comic film or a comic to a film, something that should be taken seriously. Jack Nicholson has stated that he took the character probably more seriously than anyone else who had ever played the Joker. And again, ever played the Joker. Remember, this is taking place in 1989. Actually, he would go on to consult, or at least provide some advice to Heath Ledger in his take of the Joker. And part of that advice, unfortunately, you can find video of this online, but Nicholson has stated, I warned him. I warned him. And what he's talking about there is he had warned Ledger about the toll it takes mentally to play the Joker. Anyway, what Nicholson is referring to there about how seriously he took that role is obviously is referring to anyone prior to him. But, I'm quite certain he took it as seriously as any of them that have come after. But he said, actually, that through his dealings with kids' characters, he had learned that and this is quoting him, the more you scare them, the more they'll love it. He's talking about kids. And then he went on to say, every kid loves this guy. And he's talking about the Joker. He said, and I particularly love him. And so Nicholson talks about the fact that not only did he take it more seriously than anyone that had come prior, but he brought a scarier mentality and an extreme hatred to the Joker that no one had brought prior to him. And that proved to be critical. And that is basically a lot of the key components here. The film, obviously, it releases June 23rd again, 1989. Let's take a look at it by the numbers really briefly in kind of just a little brief segment. It had 11 award wins, one of which was an Oscar for Best Art Direction and Set Decoration. It also had 28 nominations for awards. 6 of those nominations were for the BAFTAs, which are the British Academy Film Awards. Two of the other wins were People's Choice wins, which I believe was in 1990. That People's Choice win, and it was for motion picture overall, and then just favorite dramatic motion picture. So, in terms of money, the budget of this film was $35 million. $35 million. Roughly. Opening weekend in the U.S. and Canada, not worldwide, U.S. and Canada, it made $40,489,746. So opening weekend eclipsed the total budget. It goes on overall to gross in the U.S. and Canada $251,409,241, and worldwide $411,569,241. So, by the numbers, this film is a tremendous success. If you have seen this movie, I'm assuming that you would agree it's a classic. It's a tremendous success. I cannot tell you how excited I was that one of the first anniversaries I was going to get to discuss about film was going to be this movie. This movie really, like I said, it holds a very special place for me, just in my heart, for films. To me, there's just so many good one-liners from Jack Nicholson. saying, where does he get those wonderful toys? Or have you ever danced with the devil in the pale moonlight? And especially this, he says that, his character says that a couple times in the movie, but especially the scene in which Michael Keaton also it's a memorable scene. It's not just a quote, but Michael Keaton is standing beside the fireplace, and there's a vase. I believe it's off to his left is where it is, and he's got a fire poker, and he's grabbed it, and it's off to his side. And he's telling a story about a guy he knew. And then he takes the poker and he swings it up and shatters the vase. And he says, "You want to get nuts? Come on, let's get nuts." Just classic. It is by far one of the best comic book films I have ever seen. It is absolutely cinema, by the way, in my opinion. But it deserves all of the accolades, the love that it gets, and it's just it's timeless. It's timeless, and a lot to be learned from it. So that is Batman, 1989, directed by Tim Burton, starring Michael Keaton and Jack Nicholson. The screenwriting by Sam Hamm. Executive produced by Michael Eslin. Incredible movie. So happy 35th anniversary to this absolute classic. I'm so thankful that this movie exists, and thankful for the people that starred in it and directed it. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope it gave you more information about this movie, that it was enjoyable, and happy 35th anniversary, Batman.